Welcome to the Business Wingmen Show. We're glad you're back for another exciting episode with your co-host, Steve Smith, which is me, and my son, Travis Smith. We're the ones that do this show, and we're happy to have you here today. So whether you're watching us here on YouTube or just listening to us on any one of your favorite podcast stations, you're getting the same content. So welcome aboard. What we're going to deep dive into today is a topic that I know a lot of people in leader roles experience at some point, depending on how long you've been with a company or in the particular role you have. And it's, how do you help your team adapt to new leadership? You know, maybe it's you that's new to the team, or maybe it's people above you that are calling the shots that are new to the company, and that's coming down through the team, and the team's having a hard time with it. So we're going to talk about that today. And what you can do is either the person at the top or somebody along the chain of command to help your team adapt to what might be a new strategy, a new philosophy, maybe just a new style that they're not used to. So Travis, I'm sure in your work history, you've run into a scenario where all of a sudden things coming from above just start sounding different. And have you ever had that? How did you acclimate to clearly different leadership in an organization you were a part of?
Gosh, well, I mean, one of the things that's inevitable is that the person who is ultimately responsible for you and your job, i.e. your boss, that's going to change periodically throughout your career. And hopefully it doesn't change too often.
Right.
Because one of the stories I think about, you've shared a couple times on this podcast, is you had started a new job as like a district sales manager, and you were something like 7 of 7 within the last just a couple years.
Oh no, that was 8 of 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think about those people that you were managing. Think about what they dealt with, because immediately you coming in, whether it was 8 of 8 or it was 2 of 3, whatever it is, right?
Right.
They're immediately on the offensive. And I think
Yes.
about that with my own career, right? Is I've had times where I've had new bosses come in, and it's funny because you kind of treat them to a degree with like arm's distance length, of like, I don't know how long you're going to be around here. I don't really know what you're all about, and
yes.
And so there's a certain amount of like caution and, I just, a lot of people don't feel comfortable in those modes. Right. And
yes, absolutely.
And then what could perhaps happen to your job as a result of that? So I think talking today about what are the things that a person can do who has a new boss? What can they do to make it so that not only the first impression is a good one, but as things move forward quickly, you're on the right side of the fence?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. All right. So that's good. That's a good thing to look at, because I have been in situations like that where I've had new bosses. Sometimes I knew it was coming. It was a promotion up through, and I really liked the person. I thought, okay, this is going to be good. The person showing up was going to be infinitely better than the person we had. That's always a positive experience. But then other times there's situations where you have that happen and you don't really expect it, and you don't know much about the person. And the one thing I found that immediately causes people to become, like you said, a little bit maybe withdrawn, sometimes defensive, suspicious, is because they've immediately tapped into the water cooler talk, the grapevine, and they've got nothing but bad commentary about who this person is. Nobody really knows who they are, but everybody's decided that it's not good. And so your head is immediately infected with, okay, beware, danger, Will Robertson, kind of stuff like that. And so that I think that a lot of times to the person on the team who's trying to figure out how to navigate their way through it, that's something you have to watch out for right up front, because it's real easy to get sucked into that, especially if a friend or a colleague of yours that you trust is feeding you that. Now you've got to deal with your own head.
Well, I'm really glad you used the word suspicious, because a lot of that is founded on very little accurate information most of the time.
Right.
It's kind of going back to your comment just now about water cooler talk. And that's so important to separate emotion from fact, right?
Yes.
Just because someone's new, some new leader coming in, it's a new face. It's probably going to be a new approach, right? That doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad thing, but the way that we handle that transition a lot of times makes all the difference. So
no, I get it. And in fact, I have a client now who is going through kind of a variation of that. The owner, kind of the patriarch of the company, is still there, but he's kind of taken a little bit of a backseat because he's trying to get upper management to kind of take control over the day-to-day operations. And they haven't done a particularly good job of instilling the culture that these people who have been around less than a year have to really consider. They don't have to be lockstep with it, but they need to consider the culture that's already there when they show up. And they're not really doing that. I mean, they're not doing harm, but they're implementing a lot of new and different ways of doing things and directives and stuff. And some of the people at the mid-level who are responsible for various parts of the business around the country are shaking their heads. They're like, well, who are these people? We didn't necessarily like everything that was coming from the top before, but at least we knew it. It was the devil we knew. We understood it. We knew where it came from. We were used to it. And now these guys are interjecting new stuff, and we're not real sure what to do with that.
Well, the other piece too is when you think about the information you're getting about the situation or this new person coming in, you have to step back and kind of think about where that information is coming from as well. Because what if the new person who's coming in, we'll call that new leader Sally? Well, what if you're talking to John and John's feeding you a load of information, but what you don't know behind the scenes was that John went for that job as well and didn't get it.
Oh, yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
The information you may be getting or the way that you may be feeling about a new leader might not be based in reality or even good information, just because there's a lot of things at play, right?
Right.
Does the new leader come from inside the organization or do they come from outside the organization, right? So there's a ton of factors that go into that.
Well, especially if the person you're referencing, the home court advantage, didn't get it and it went to somebody from the outside, that person, unless they're really mature and they've really made sense of the fact that, maybe they weren't quite ready, but they were there. Okay. So they thought they might get the advantage for being there and it didn't happen. That person can sling a whole bunch of crap around that can cause other people a lot of uneasiness, but they've got an axe to grind.
And I agree wholeheartedly, but I think that the other piece of that too is it doesn't necessarily need to be somebody coming in from externally, right? It could just be another individual internally. Maybe they came from another business unit, another department, right? And you didn't know them.
Yep.
So it's just the fact that individual is an unknown entity and you're going to have to figure that out. And that goes into, as I was kind of preparing for this discussion today, I came across a great article that was talking about the woman who wrote it. Her name's Sophie Deering, but she talks about one of the best things that you can do just to kind of get things off on the right foot is to really go out of your way to make a good first impression.
Yes.
And there are some really simple things that you can do. And I kind of put this in the basket of like, well, that's kind of obvious stuff for a professional, but all right, it makes sense, which is show up and be on time, be punctual. Right. And then in that mode of like, this is kind of your first impression, right?
Mm-hmm.
Presenting yourself in a manner where someone's going to remember you positively and not negatively. Right. And it's so funny how those two things are so small. But the funny thing is, if those, I guess, activities, if you will, were to be negative, you'll have an incredibly hard time overcoming that with that new leader, because already 5 minutes in, their mindset is baked that you're already behind the curve and probably need to be replaced anyways.
All right. So, and those are very good fundamental things that surprisingly, a lot of people discount or they're just not consistent with. But I would advocate that in order to get to that point where you embrace just fundamentally good business acumen, okay, before you get to that point, in your head, you've got to kind of settle your emotions down and basically withhold judgment. Because if you're in that judgmental mode, any bad act that you do is going to be justified because you think the person that just took the job is rotten and they're not going to be around that long.
Well, and to that point, making sure that you're setting aside judgment, but also not comparing them to the previous boss.
Yes.
Right. Whether or not your previous boss was good or they were bad, right? That has nothing to do with this new individual coming in.
Right.
even if that person is coming from another part of your organization. To the best of our ability in this transition period, you really have to give that person a clean slate and give them the opportunity to rise up and do the right things, rather than setting them on a pedestal that's basically burning underneath their feet. You're just waiting, for them to screw up, and then just so you can say in your head, "I knew it, I called it."
Right? Yes. And another kind of a bad act I used to witness when things like this would happen is there would always be people in the existing team who either had justifiable links to people above this person in the senior level, or they thought they had links to people, and they would open that door and use that opportunity to voice their concern or complain to people that are above the person that just got put into that managerial role. And it's like, because I at one point I was at that level and would get calls from people about, who is this person? I mean, why did you bring this person in? And so it was almost like you'd have to sit there and listen, and just try to, kind of let them kind of vent. But at some point, depending on the tone, it was like they're calling you out because they think you made a bad decision and the person's only been on the job 3 days. So those were other things that now you've not only got a perception problem with your immediate new boss, but you've put a seed in the head of the person above that about just how you handle change up in business, which you started off saying, it happens all the time. I mean, if you're in business long enough, you're going to go through several of them.
Well, and to that point, like I'm a firm believer in most organizations, this would be the case that, there's a chain of command, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't just, even if you do have a relationship with the CEO, if you're a director and you have a new boss that's a VP, going to the CEO to talk about that, you're not putting yourself in a good situation.
Right.
And unfortunately, the CEO is going to remember that a lot longer than you will.
Yes.
But as we're talking about the process of new leadership coming in and how we either mentally deal with it or how we deal with it in the physical world, of meaning how we show up with our work efforts, how we show up from a management perspective. One of the things that I find interesting is it doesn't matter what the job title is of the person who's coming in as the new leader. It's interesting how when you read articles or you talk with people who are in that transition, even seasoned vets are somewhat nervous about the experience. So
the leader themselves.
Right.
Yes.
Right. The new person coming in, right? Because they don't know what they're coming into a lot of times, or maybe they were told something, and as we all know, just because you were told that doesn't make it reality.
Right.
So I had someone tell me this, it was a number of years ago, and I was like, God, that's really good insight, which was, if we can put ourselves in the shoes of that individual and then act accordingly, which is really kind of giving them some grace.
Yeah.
And saying, and maybe even we have this conversation with them if, in that kind of first 1 or 2 meetings, the dialogue seems good. It seems like this could, we're building some good rapport. Just openly say to that person, hey, I'm empathetic to the fact that you're coming in as the new leader here. I just want to let you know I'm here to support you however I can. That little piece of just kind of like an olive branch, if you will, being like, hey, I get it. You're the new guy. You're the boss. But if there's anything I can do to make that transition easier for you, I mean, that makes a huge difference in the eye of that leader.
I think you're right. It is. And it's a very small thing to do. Like you said, show up on time, conduct yourself in a professional manner. That you can put that in those box of little, business tips that anybody can benefit from, and it doesn't cost you anything. Now, here's the other side to that, which I think prevents a lot of people from being willing to extend that olive branch, if you will. And that's if they're in their head, they've worked themselves up into emotional fever that they can't accept the decision that was made. Either some friend of theirs who they believe should have gotten that role didn't, so they're pissed off about that. Maybe they were the ones that should have gotten it and didn't. Or just because the person is showing up and they just walk a little different, they speak a little different. Maybe they came from an industry that the home court team doesn't, in their minds, doesn't think, how how could somebody from that business come in here and do this job? I mean, people come up with all kind of reasons why decisions weren't done well. And so if you've got that emotional baggage that you can't figure out what to do with, I think one of the best things you can do, if you don't have this as a part of just the business you're in, find somebody else in the company, kind of like a mentor. We've had shows on the past where we've talked about the benefits of having mentors in companies. Find somebody that's like a mentor that you can just vent to. Just tell them up front, look, I'm not happy about this. I know it's not right. I'm trying to figure out what to do with it, but I just need somebody to just vent to. And you give them a heads up, and then you spend 5 minutes just saying whatever you got to say. But if that gets it out of your system and allows that person to play things back to you so you can hear what it sounds like, it's a hard thing to do, but it will get you off of that emotional roller coaster that's probably not going to end well for you if you don't do something with it.
Right. Well, so as we're talking about this, I'm reminded of, it was probably in my career one of the first big changes I experienced as a result of leadership change with a direct boss of mine.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I was, I don't know, maybe 3 years into my career out of college. The boss who I had at that point was kind of larger than life in a way, of his small fiefdom that he oversaw. I mean, he was kind of the bee's knees. Like, he was popular. He oversaw a very successful business for years upon years, had been given awards and all this kind of stuff. So I always looked at him, as I was reporting to him, as a good boss. And still to this day, I would say the same thing. The funny thing is, when the new guy came in, who was an out of towner,
Mm-hmm.
none of us really knew him.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't really sure what to think. But I can tell you that I was disappointed in the fact that I didn't have my old boss anymore, because I knew what to expect with that individual.
Right. Yes.
But over a period of, we'll call it maybe 6 months to 9 months, I learned very quickly that it actually was a blessing in disguise getting the new boss, for two primary reasons. Not necessarily that he was much younger than the other one, but his mentality in terms of running his business was a little bit more new age, and not so kind of like early 90s, dictatorish,
Right.
So that was a fresh
command and control.
Yeah. But this new guy who came in, he's like 6'7". He's kind of like the Jolly Green Giant. He just changed the way that operation just mentally acted, because it was a much more inclusive environment, right? Whereas prior, the king and his fiefdom, it was just, he gave an order and we all executed. And there was nothing wrong with that. I was fine operating in that space.
Right.
But then all of a sudden, this new guy comes in, and he's much more willing to get your buy-in before a decision is made. He's much more willing.
All right. So it probably took some span of time for you to recognize and put your arms around that. How did you adapt to the change up and be willing to wait until you saw what you ended up liking better?
Well, I think the first piece was the leader who went out because he got promoted. I had a good relationship with him in the sense that, I could do my job under him, everything was fine, but I wouldn't say I was really close to him. And that's because he was just kind of beyond me at that point. Right. So when the new guy came in, I just didn't have any preconceived notions to build off of. So I think that kind of helped. The other piece to answer your question was, there just wasn't a lot of water cooler talk because no one knew him. And what we did know of him was he was successful in his job prior. So, that kind of offers a little bit of extra bandwidth, right? When someone was a badass or really good in their job prior, you're like,
right.
Oh, all right, well, but the bigger thing that we started to notice, which was rather quick in his job, was the new guy who came in, Mr. Jolly Green Giant. He very quickly had a different style that many of us looked at was better. That doesn't mean he was better at his job than the last guy by any means, but it just, for us and the way that we wanted to operate, the way that we wanted buy-in. We knew the operation, we knew how to roll it. He was very much interested in our perspective. and then helped to build his new operation around our feedback.
Right.
That really didn't happen, correct?
Hmm.
So, only a couple of these sessions in, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, all right, I didn't expect this. The new guy potentially is better than the last guy. And the last guy wasn't bad.
Right.
So the funny thing is, I think a lot of times when we go into situations where we just don't know, we don't have an answer, right?
Yep.
We make an assumption, and that assumption is that the grass is not going to be greener. This is going to suck. I'm going to have to work harder. I'm not going to get along with this guy. Do I need to go? And you start doing that rabbit hole of excuses and just the mind bender, right?
Right.
But the funny thing was, it didn't end up being that. And I ended up working for that company another 6.5 years and got promoted 2 or 3 more times underneath the new guy. So it ended up being an amazing career experience.
Right. But the point is, you were willing to give that individual time to demonstrate their style and then figure out how to adapt to it, as opposed to jumping into these judgments about why is this person here and what message is the company trying to send, and am I in hot water, and all this other kind of stuff that can totally preoccupy and derail people, and cause them to be their own worst enemy for their own career management because they can't get their head straight.
Well, and for what it's worth, I mean, there was a group of us that were, as kind of the years went on, we kind of got together and we now became the senior leadership within the operation.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was this, I don't know, it was kind of like a triad of, you have kind of the big boss, like a triangle, and then you had our crew, right, that was helping him run the organization. And it just was a different feel. And I look back on that, and that really was a great lesson for me professionally, in that you really need to give things time.
Mm-hmm.
And even if you have a rough instance with something, that doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the case moving forward.
Yes.
Right. So we also have to be really careful to not make judgments based off of one single data point, right? Or one single meeting or one conversation.
Right.
Because that's also not accurate either.
No, I agree with you. I think it really does boil down to resisting the temptation to get hooked into other people's preconceived ideas that may not serve you well. Not being able to control your emotions and withhold judgment long enough, and then be able to say, look, I need to show up my best. I need to extend that olive branch, be of help and service to this person who's trying to acclimate to either a new department or a new company. And like you said, let time work for you, just wait it out until you see evidence of one thing or another.
Well, when you think back into your career, I mean, did you have any instances where you had a transition occur and either maybe you didn't handle it well or that boss didn't handle it well? That would actually be something that I'd be interested in hearing, because that kind of feedback is good for our listeners to better understand maybe what not to do in these instances.
Well, my second company, Lysol, was a great company. I was there for like a total of 12 years. Did a lot of good stuff, enjoyed it a lot. At one point, I started running the East Coast sales operation. And
was Lysol where you would go do those kind of like president's trips out to Hawaii?
Yes.
God,
yes.
That was awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, those were some good perks.
I mean, just from that standpoint alone, I'll give them a thumbs up. That was
Well, but before we even came out to the West Coast, on the East Coast, I'd been promoted up to running the East Coast sales operation. The guy that was doing it before me got promoted up to a national kind of a VP level job. So he was still in line, but now he had the whole country to look at, not just, one division. And, everybody, I was a known quantity, and, the people that I report to all stayed the same. But it took a while for them to separate out their relationship and, quite honestly, their admiration for the guy that had moved up, and I had kind of moved in, I slotted myself in. And I can remember in one case, the one of the region managers reported to me. He was down in the Southeast, very buttoned up guy, had great relationships, really did his job well. And the mistake I made was not getting to know him well enough up front and assuming that he needed direction. And that is a fundamental flaw that a lot of people would get into. I experienced it myself. And when I finally realized that the better thing to do was just open up the conversation and just say, look, here's what we need. How do you plan on handling, or how would you suggest we do it? And get the benefit of his knowledge, because he was in that Southeast area of the country a whole lot longer than me. He knew exactly where the hot spots and the weak spots and everything else were and the things they had to look at. But I insisted on telling him how I thought he should do it. And, we finally had a conversation about it. And thankfully he showed up and said, hey, look, we need to discuss this. And it went well. And we had a great relationship for the rest of the time that I was out there. But I look back on that and I'm thinking, here's a solid guy that needed to be given all the latitude to do what he did best. And I can kind of learn my new role while he's taking care of business. And I didn't do that. I immediately jumped into assuming he needed direction, and I gave him plenty of it.
Well, what's funny about that story is that, again, we're making assumptions, right? Mm-hmm. You made assumptions about that moment. Whereas if we would just kind of settle that down for a moment and just bother to ask a very simple question.
Right.
Right. My former boss he was always kind of famous for saying, seek to understand before being understood.
Yes.
And I love that, because what it really means is you're going to take a moment to shut up and actually bother to learn, ask questions before you formulate an opinion. Right. And that's such a valuable piece for any business professional, because what it tells us is that rather than going in and kind of flying, by the seat of our pants,
right,
sometimes there's a lot of good that comes out of pausing and just starting to ask questions to kind of then figure out what your best approach is for moving forward.
Well, everything you're talking about here comes under this big giant heading of emotional intelligence. And it's a big deal in corporate America today, because it really defines how well people develop relationships and create loyalties and other things like that are kind of the soft skill, the human element of being in business. Back in the late 70s through most of the 80s, nobody knew that. It wasn't like life was completely different. That just wasn't a point of focus. It was more of the take charge, command the ship, set the direction, get everybody going in the right direction. Stopping along the way and asking for people's opinion? No, nobody talked about that. Nobody even suggested that. And I look back now on a lot of things that I was involved in, and I realized, wow, we probably could have done it better if we had really kind of brought people into the conversation. Like you said earlier, that inclusion element. I mean, the whole idea of having your chosen few that you would go to all the time and talk with and give advance notice to, that was rampant in corporate America. And there was a lot of people, really good people, that may not have been in that inner circle, that felt left out all the time. And it affected them mentally in terms of, what they did and how they did it and the reasons why they did it. And I can look back now and realize that, a lot of people didn't do their best or left and went to work for other companies because they got tired of that, what they used to call that good old boys club.
Right. I can see that side of it, but I also think there's a certain amount of, maybe we need to address that's like, don't freaking worry about it. That's not your job. Your job is to make a meaningful contribution for whatever it is you were hired for.
Right.
But it really does amaze me how much time is spent at work with, I see this all across the board. I see this at all of our clients, how much time is spent on activities that are not work related and are really more just about feeling and making people feel good about,
right.
You know what? I think a fair amount of them are probably good. So I'm certainly not poo-pooing those. But at the same time, it's like, look, you were hired to do a job. Yes, you want to work at a place where you feel welcomed. you feel like you're engaged, right? But in a leadership change, that's not the time to all of a sudden be like, you know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater and making all of these assumptions and getting all hyphy about. It's like, you know what? Sometimes just putting your head down and doing your job is a good way to deal with things.
Sure, and we've basically in this whole episode here been talking about the team individual, how you get through this. But I can tell you on the flip side, that new person, whether they're from another part of the company or they're outside coming in, there's some things that that person can do to help themselves greatly acclimate to an established team in an established culture. And the one thing you should never do, even sometimes if it's kind of intimated when you take the job, okay, here's some things you got to take care of really quick. First thing you should never do in the first week you're on the job, don't ever fire anybody.
Oh gosh, well, yeah.
But I have seen that happen. And you talk about a ripple effect that doesn't end well. That's the best way to do it. I mean, even if you know somebody has been on the chopping block and the last two people before you just didn't have the guts to call that shot, it doesn't mean you do it within even the first 30 days. I mean, settle things out before you sit down and have some hardcore conversations with people who probably shouldn't be there. But, you've got to be kind of empathetic about the people that are already there that are now trying to figure you out. And so there's a little bit of adapting to leadership change on both sides of the fence.
Well, and so you just brought up the piece about the leader's perspective, right? And coming into the new team. And
yep.
I've seen some leaders do some really cool things. Like, for example, I saw one leader literally hold a small town hall meeting and literally just address a lot of the things you and I are talking about right now.
Right.
I thought that was so smart.
Yes.
It literally addressed the angst of a new leader coming in. Their style in terms of management versus the last person.
Right.
Are there going to be layoffs? This person literally went step by step down all of those criteria and just openly addressed them before anybody had the chance to formulate a BS mental picture of what was going on.
Yes.
Right. And I was like, wow, that's a really good idea, because you're getting ahead of it as the new leader. Right. And perhaps quelling a lot of the water cooler talk that develops, thereafter.
Yes. Yeah. And I think that's really smart to help kind of take some of the pressure out of the room and get people to at least maybe dismiss the real arcane things that might be floating around. But the next thing and I've had this happen to me when I was in my corporate role back in New York, where you would have new people come in and they would be so project inundated in terms of just trying to learn things and get things done. You might, as the employee, might not have a serious or intimate conversation with them for the first 3 or 4 months they're on the job. And that is way, way too long. That is way too long not to be interfacing with the people that you now have, authority over. You got to, certainly within the first couple of weeks, you got to be able to sit down with them and get to know them and maybe on a one-to-one basis, answer a few questions. Because, if you pick the right person up front and you answer those questions, that information is going to get all over the rest of the department before you get back to your office. So if you're a little strategic about it and you've done your homework, you may even know the person to start with. But you have to reach out and welcome people onto their team that they're already there with you being the new leader, if you're going to have any opportunity to make an impact on them as time goes on.
Gosh, I would even challenge the comment you just made about a couple weeks. Your number one priority as a new leader going in is to make sure that the team that is there, the people that are on the bus, are able to continue moving forward successfully.
Right.
In my opinion, that should be the number one thing you're doing. The strategy, the way the division or the organization operates, that can be learned down the road.
Mm-hmm.
But making sure your team has all of the things that they need and or getting in front of some of these discussions we've talked about today, that should be priority one. That should at least start within the first week.
Yeah. And I don't think there's anything wrong about, getting the whole group together and introducing yourself and talking about, things and asking questions of them and giving them an opportunity. But, as time goes on, depending on how big the team is, it may take a while. I mean, like I was just saying, that position I was in back on the East Coast, there was 27 people in that group from Maine to Florida. And so I knew there was some people I wasn't going to get a chance to spend a day with for a little bit of time, just given the size of it. But there are ways, especially today with Zoom, there's ways to interface fairly quick.
Well, we've been on the discussion now about 35, 40 minutes. So I'm curious, given what we've talked about today, when it relates to a new leader coming in, you now have a new boss.
Right.
What's one of the things that we talked about today where you're like, you know what, if I was back in that situation, this is the first thing I would do?
Yeah, I think without question, the first thing I would do is check my own thoughts, my own emotions, and figure out a way, even if they're unresolved, figure out a way to put them aside and be able to approach the new person, welcome them on board without any indication that I've already got an issue with them and I don't even know their full name. That because what goes on in your head affects, your voice tone, your facial expressions, everything else that you do. You have to be able to get your head checked. And to your point, give some time, allow some time to take place to make sure that you really know who this person is before you go throwing judgments around.
I like that. I think the positive thinking, right? Not only instilling that in yourself, but in your first interaction with whoever this new leader is, making sure that that's a positive experience.
Yes.
Those two activities right there between kind of managing your own expectations and then making sure that first interaction with your new boss is a healthy one.
Right.
You'll be well served moving forward.
Absolutely. All right, folks, we've chewed this one up good today. Hopefully you've been able to pull a few tips out of it that might help you. If you're going, you're getting in that situation right now, if you're going to get a new boss or a new boss has just showed up and you're kind of struggling with this, hopefully some of the stuff we've talked about will help you through it. That's it for today's show. Thanks for being with us. As always, you can visit our website at businesswingmen.com, or you can see us on Apple and Google Podcast and Spreaker and iHeartRadio, any place that you normally go for podcasts, we're there. You can go and look at all the past shows and find other interesting topics that you want to listen to. But we thank you for being here. We hope you'll subscribe and stick with us as we continue to bring you new material every Tuesday at 4:00. And Travis, how do you want to finish this show up?
Happy to be your wingman anytime.
Yeah, this is a good, we do a good job being each other's wingman. I certainly learn a lot from you from a different perspective, more youthful perspective, which is always a good thing. So take care, everybody. We'll talk to you next week.